you think back to like when we started flying in the mid 90s, we would sling BDUs and stuff like that. It's because the radar that was our only ranging source. And if the bore sight was wrong, it might look like the pipper's on the target, but it's ranging something, 10 degrees off axis, 1,000 yards away or whatever. So anyway, so just some really interesting stuff. Being a test pilot for me comes down to like two things. We're all control freaks. We want to make sure the thing does what we want it to do when we want it to do it, and that's flight controls of a pod, controls of a radar. And then it's all about database decisions, right? Because I like to say without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And opinions are good. We, as test pilots, we take in a lot of opinions and we find ways to score them.
Tower, Air Force release you, runway 4 left, wind 040 at 5, clear for takeoff.
Seat tied, altimeter 0 eyes, we're clear for takeoff, clear for the airspace. Viper check through. My burn ramp curve was at 354 minutes. So yeah, flights on. Next picture, 16, 15,000, target, some of that. Viper on target.
Coma, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Happy to have you on here.
Thanks, Rain. I appreciate the opportunity to come in and chat with you.
Yeah, we were just joking beforehand. My intention was to reach out to you personally. However, my email got hacked and it was a phishing scam. That's how we first connected, really got this ball rolling. So I appreciate you touching base and really getting this thing moving. So thanks again for, one, taking the time, and two, reaching out.
Yeah, no worries. Glad it worked out.
Yeah, so Coma, I have a little bio here for you. This is probably something we could do a mini series on. When I think I've accomplished something in life and then I see your bio, I'm like, well, I haven't done anything, because you've done many things. So you grew up in a small town in Arizona, just down the road from John Wayne's ranch. You're son of a fighter pilot, nephew of another, descendant of a glider infantryman who jumped into Sicily during Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. So you got service in your blood. You started flying GPS satellites during Desert Storm. You fought MiG-29s over Germany. You've deployed to Northern Watch, Southern Watch. You've flown the mighty Viper. You were the first Air National Guard pilot to ever go to test pilot school. And you've led some of the cutting edge testing for planes that I don't think, or things we haven't heard about yet that are behind the door, which is pretty cool. So you've shot everything from a 50 cal and dropped 500-pound laser guided weapons. Been to test pilot school, flown over 30 different types of aircraft. You've departed Earth. You're one of Virgin Atlantic's first test pilots there. You had a career with Gulfstream, flying everything, I think, underneath their production lineup. And now you're currently testing sea gliders for Regent, which we can talk about a little bit more here. You're a father, musician, a glider pilot, and you've flown everything from just a small single-engine prop to, again, out to outer space, which is pretty cool. So, Coma, thanks for joining me. I think we got a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity. And I'll add just a couple of corrections in there. I am a son of a Air Force pilot. He wasn't a fighter pilot, flew C-130s, but he's dad and definitely crushed it and served his time in Vietnam, and some great history there in the family. And the other one is I have a really good PR rep out there somewhere, because all the news websites for Virgin Galactic, say I was the first commercial astronaut, but I didn't end up going to space. And we can talk a little bit about that story. I did spend 2 years there, 2.5, getting to test some really cool vehicles. One of them was the mothership that hauled the spaceship up to altitude, and I also got to do some glide flights in the spaceship itself, but it was all in the atmosphere testing, and the guys that came on after me got the chance to go do that, and are still at it, actually, on the commercial side. So
it's wild. How high did you fly?
So, when we were testing, and this is back in the 2011, 2013 timeframe, White Knight and Spaceship were basically just starting their initial test evolution. They were a spin-off, or the next level of what Burt Rutan and Skilled Composites had done back in 2004 in an effort to win what was called the X Prize. And it was a prize that's taken on different incarnations, but this particular one was take a certain amount of payload into space and do it 2 times within a certain time period. I think it was like a week or 10 days. And Bert took on the challenge and made some very unique vehicles. And the cutting line for space is like roughly 330,000 feet. which is what they had to exceed. And he came up with this novel approach to win it, which was not to go out of the atmosphere and orbit, but basically go up, tag 3 or 4 minutes of 0G, and then bring the vehicle back in and land it, and then obviously get the cycle time down where they could do that a couple times in a couple of weeks. And at the time, Richard Branson was very enamored with that effort, which ultimately was successful, and put in a bid with Skilled Composites in Mojave to go build these other 2 vehicles. And but White Knight itself is just a fantastic airplane. It's basically a 757 size airframe, dual fuselage. You fly from the right side, and the 2 fuselages are connected with one giant wing, 140 feet all the way across, and the whole vehicle's carbon fiber, including the cables that you use to control the flight control surfaces and the seats that you sit in. And that there's a big gap in between the 2 fuselages, and that's where you mount the spaceship. And that vehicle we've had up into the 50s, and it would probably go a lot higher. Engines, notwithstanding, the Pratt & Whitney 308s probably weren't meant to go that high for any significant amount of time. But anyway, so we were up there. Yep.
Yeah, I got a couple questions. The pilot and me, just actually probably the fuselage piece of it. Is that weird or is that different? Is it? I would assume the flight controls had to be designed to make it pilot natural, for lack of a better phrase, to be operating sitting over here and then still have a bunch of mass off to the other side.
Yeah, that was one of the weirdest things. I always, there's 3 or 4 of us that flew it, and sitting in the left seat, every once in a while you'd kind of look over to your left side and you would flinch because there's another fuselage flying perfect formation with you, and it's a welded wingman, and it took 4 or 5 flights to get over that. But the real differences come in landing. That fuselage sits about 25 feet right of the center line, and Mojave's main runway is pretty wide. I think it's 150 feet, but you're landing offset, which for a fighter guy is not a big deal because you always do some staggered landings and things like that. But when you come into touchdown, you get this asymmetry, especially if you have a crosswind, where one side of the fuselage touches down first, and then the other side needs to be lowered gently, and you can easily fall into this habit of you touch down, you're done, you kind of relax on the controls, and you get a little bit of a hard drop on the other pod. And obviously we try to avoid that. So typically, even with our crosswind limits, which I think we're running around 15 knots, about the furthest up in the air that pod would be at touchdown of the primary, whether it was left or right, would be another 5 or 6 feet. But it definitely took some getting used to, and you got to fly it almost like a tailwheel airplane because of the amount of side. Those fuselages are pretty long, and you get wind effects on them, so you got to keep the nose pointed straight, and you're kind of you're basically driving a big shopping cart because you have 4 wheels, 2 mains, 2 noses. And they don't all touch at the same time. So made for some fun challenges and lots of practice getting to do that.
I mean, there's no simulator for that. But I mean, that's part of being a test pilot, right? But man, that's wild.
Yeah, and that's really, I know you had like Cinco Hamilton on, and he talked about it. The test pilot school is really about making you brushing off your engineering skills and bringing you up to the level that you can communicate with the engineers in all the discipline areas. So master of none, but a little bit deep in each one. And then the other one is to expose you to flying lots of different airplanes, so that when you hopefully see some good and bad flying characteristics, you can adapt quickly, and then you can start to quantify what's acceptable for safety, what's acceptable for meeting the contract, and then ultimately, we segue into operational tests where can it do the mission? Is it suitable for that? So yeah, nothing really prepares you for some of these unique and novel. But I had a lot of tailwheel time. I think that helped. But the real challenges with White Knight are that it's a fully reversible flight control system. So no hydraulics. All the air loads on all the surfaces come back through the controls. And because of the long wing and big ailerons, it's got some pretty high forces, especially in roll. And so the controls are a little unique. They look like a stick, but on the top of the stick there's a yoke. It's basically two handles, but the yoke doesn't rotate. So you move the whole stick left and right to put in roll, but you actually have two handholds that you can hang on to do it, and that's just to aid with the forces. And one of our pilots, Forger Stuckey, who was at the time with Scaled Composites, we were kind of doing a hybridized test team approach, would actually reach across and grab the co-pilot stick as well, because that would give him a little more leverage. So if you're trying to get big roll rates on it, you might do some unique things to make it a little more palatable. But like I said, some really weird stuff with reversible flight controls. So it's got cables, but cable stretch or contraction with a metal cable up at those altitudes and those temperatures is too much to handle. And so they went with carbon fiber, and they actually made cables out of carbon fiber, and they basically had no stretch. So you could make them as tight as you want on the ground or whatever they needed to be, and then they basically held that same tension level up at altitude. So some really novel things that come out of that kind of test program.
This is, pure layman. I'm just thinking through, too, if you're talking no augmented flight controls with hydraulics, as you change in altitude, I would imagine the control forces change. Again, I am not smart, but when I hear my U2 buddies talk, operating at those altitudes, there's a small window between high speed stall, low speed stall, and again, you can correct me on the official terms, right? But you're probably battling that all the way up in a platform like this as well.
Yeah, in fact, if somebody said, hey, what's White Knight closest to, I would say the U-2 or maybe the WB-57 that NASA flies. It's got a very high aspect ratio wing, so it's long and skinny. Laminar flow, it generates a ton of lift, and really purpose-built to lift the spaceship up to 50,000 feet, drop it around 47, I think was the target, at about 160 knots. Equivalent airspeed, which is 5 or 6 knots from calibrated airspeed at that altitude, equivalent taking into account compressibility. But you're still doing 380 true or whatever. White Knight had a Mach limit of 0.65 because it had some potentially weird effects with the aileron reversal and stuff because it wasn't hydraulically powered. And we had a 180 knot, basically calibrated airspeed limit. And so that caused some grief. And yes, the forces do change throughout the flight, primarily due to dynamic pressure. But as you get into the higher Mach regimes, you get some Mach effects on them. But yeah, it was no autopilot, hand flown the whole way, all the way up, all the way down. But really had some neat things going for it. One of the things that we could do with it was the cockpit was identically laid out like the spaceship. So same displays, same controls, just implemented slightly differently in the spaceship. But we could come back and hit high key, and we could practice the Spaceship 2 approaches, which are basically a F-16 SFO, starting a little bit lower, around 7,000 feet. And had huge speed brakes on the trailing edge of the center section of the wing. And so we could basically get the same L over D, which I want to say was about 10 to 1. So about a 6 degree flight path angle. And you could fly that all the way around and practice all that stuff. So some really cool things, some nice thought processes that went into building that vehicle.
That's wild. A whole lot we could talk about.
Yeah.
And again, I'm just fascinated by it. So maybe put a pin in that. I want to jump back to where it all began for you. Obviously, we kind of alluded to your dad was a C-130 pilot during Vietnam. Uncle flying in the Air Force as well. I imagine that is where the bug landed and got you interested in pursuing this path.
Yeah, absolutely. So, family, both sides, mom and dad. Mom's brother was a navigator, then Air Force pilot. He was in pilot training same time as my dad. My mom came down to teach school at Williams Air Force Base and went to a party, met my dad. They ended up getting engaged and married a couple weeks later. And I think they'll be on their 60th anniversary this year. So pretty impressive, and then I had some great uncles on my dad's side. One was a P-40 crew chief in North Africa, and then ended up on the P-47s, plus G raids. Some pretty neat legacies there, and then one great uncle who was an airborne glider infantryman, and did the D-Day invasion. Actually ended up landing the second day at St. Mary Glace. Went back over to the UK and came over for Market Garden. Went across the river, ended up at Battle of the Bulge, survived all that. Spent another year during the repatriation of Germany, and a couple Purple Hearts, and went to work for John Deere Tractor for 40 years.
Wow.
In Moline, Illinois, of all places, after he got back. So I love the old generation's stories. I love the aviators, even the folks that peripherally involved, and they talk about the greatest generation, and clearly they were. And we're seeing a lot of the same stuff now with our Vietnam era veterans. And I'm fortunate enough to be involved with a group of folks that we're all friends and acolytes of Robin Olds, and they get together every year a couple times, and the stories there are fantastic and some great stuff.
Yeah, I can only imagine be a fly on the wall hearing some of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, so how did you go about going into the Air Force and down this path? What were some of those steps there?
Yeah, it was small school, small town. Did pretty good in school. My mom was a school teacher, so I had a little bit of impetus there. And somebody said, "Hey, you're pretty good at math and science. You should, pick a really good school." And so they said. I said, "Well, what are really good engineering, math, and science schools?" And they said, "Well, what about this place called MIT in Boston?" I didn't know anything about it. Never visited, applied. I still think I got in under the geographic diversity clause because I didn't have near the prep, but it was expensive. So we ended up, I was already interested in the Air Force. I haven't grown up around it. Hadn't started flying yet, but signed up for the Air Force ROTC scholarship. Got the 4-year deal, and headed off to Boston. And first year I'm there, I get a chance to go start flying. And this is a funny story, or at least coincidental, and you'll appreciate it. I'm flying out at Hanscom Air Force Base, and they have an aero club. But at the time, I hadn't figured out that as a ROTC cadet I could do that. So I went to this place called Executive Flyers, which is on the civilian side of Hanscom, which was run by one guy named Myron Goulian, who had a son named Mike Goulian. And so I started there in the spring of '86, and Mike was working the line, and I knew who he was. But the salient point for me was the day he got his first aerobatic airplane. I was sitting there waiting for my instructor, and I think it was a white Pitts special, gets delivered, and obviously he's ecstatic, and I'm like, that's pretty cool, and then, you start to hear about him 20 years later, all the great things he did. And I had a good chance to run into him at Sun and Fun a couple of years ago. And he didn't remember me, but he remembered the day. And his dad was the DPE at Boston in that area, and he was the one who gave me my private pilot check ride. So I've loved your podcast because you have a lot of my friends or my acquaintances on there, and it's always fun to hear the stories again and see how well they've done. And it's a very diverse aviation group, obviously, that you have on. So, flew, finished up 4 years there, and got selected to go off to NJET, active duty. But during that time period, I had about a year delay before I could come on active duty. And in that time period, the Air Force decided they had too many pilots, and ended up with the option to get out or take a desk job and go into the stack. And ended up working at Sea Springs on the GPS program because I had an engineering degree. And they were saying 4 to 5 years, and at the time no one was getting fighters. And about 12 months into that, I found out about this thing called the Air National Guard. And turned out that one of my employers, I had worked at Hanscom for a year while I was waiting to come on active duty, was a test pilot. And he had 2 good friends that were still at Buckley, A7 guys that he had flown with in Vietnam. Made the introductions, went up. I don't know, they had 40 or 50 kids interviewing for a couple of slots for UPT. And obviously I was already commissioned and qualified. And I got picked up and and then had to go back and tell my boss at Space Command that I wanted to Palace Chase out of the active duty, at the 18-month point, and ended up doing that. And I show up at Shepherd in middle of '92, and I'm in the second class of all Air National Guard pilots. And up to that point, I don't know, there was the class in front of us that was the first, and I don't know that there were any Air National Guard pilots who had been before, because they tend to preserve Shepherd for active duty kids and academy folks. Yeah. And but because we were the only ones getting fighters, they said, "Hey, go do it." And another funny story: I'm walking down the hallway the first day I'm there, and talking to this guy, and he starts asking me who I am and what's my background, and I tell him I'm with the Colorado Air National Guard, going to pilot training, and he looks at me and he goes, "Wait, you already know what you're going to fly?" And I go, "Yeah." And that was Raisin Kane.
That's
funny. So Raisin's, 5 classes in front of me. He graduates probably 4 or 5 months before we do, and so I always tell him I'm the guy that gave you the idea. But we've crossed paths multiple times in our careers and stayed good friends, and super excited to have him where he's at today. But that just shows you, how small of a world it is. So
it really is. It's fun. I don't know where this will fit in the lineup when it gets released. I've done several interviews, obviously from back with Raisin over the last few months, where a lot of guys who ended up in that banked world, which or the threat of being banked, or just that time period where it was a drawdown. There wasn't a whole lot happening. So, it's finding your way. In my mind, I'm like, hopefully the Air Force saw like, hey, we've got a MIT grad. Let's put them somewhere we can use them. And you didn't have to fight your way to get to get to Colorado to do that. But in that time period, again, getting a guard slot when everyone and their brothers looking for a job is pretty impressive to me. Go find that and go up the road. And again, in a time when the internet wasn't around, you had to be a little bit more proactive, I would imagine, to get there and land in that spot.
Yeah. It's actually was less competitive then than it is even now. I hear stories like Buckley, ending up with 300 or 400 applicants. There was a lot of folks who didn't know much about the Guard. The people that knew about the Guard were local kids that worked as crew chiefs out there. And that's still kind of their business model for a lot of units. They like to hire folks that are local. But yeah, the Air Force was supportive, and it all worked out in the end. But there are so many of us, plus or minus, from I think 92 to 94, 95, that have really strange stories. And so my career path is it can't be really repeated. And people ask me like, how would I do what you did? And I don't honestly know how to tell them, because I really never had an assignment from the porch. I either was offered something and I took it, or I went out and created it, and it was really my whole career can be summed up in that every step along the way I had amazing people who invested time and energy in me and saw something and then gave me a skill, gave me an open door to some sort of program or information, or introduced me to somebody that propelled me on to the next step. And I heard horror stories, about, guys getting assignments they don't want. Tammy 21 comes to mind. Yeah. I was blessed. I never had to do that. I felt pretty bad for those folks. But yeah, relationships matter, and I appreciate that. The further I get away from where I started and how I got there, the more it's important to me how it all happened. And so but that's the cool part about aviation, small world. And I think people tend to take care of good people. So,
well, on that thread, I do agree. Like, I think more and more, the older I get, the relationships and your network is so vital and important. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and make an assumption. I think probably 2, your temperament, your personality, your drive made you that person where people would want to help. And then again, I put myself what I would think if I was facing being banked or just a bad deal when I want to be a pilot. You can go with the poor pitiful me and just let it happen to you, which again, sometimes like the bad deal train's going to show up and you got to get on it. Yep. But also kind of having a drive to find a path that is something you're interested in or might lead to other opportunities. Like you have to have that drive to navigate those I guess, raw deals, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And there's some classic examples out there of folks who went through all that and they turned out better for it, I'm sure. So
yeah, 100%. So obviously Egypt sounds like that goes well, and then you're back to Buckley. You obviously got to do work some things like that.
Yeah, go back to Buckley. Buckley's kind of an eclectic mix when I get back. They've just converted from A7s to F-16s. We've still got a lot of the probably half and half folks that are new, and that's there's a decent amount of folks that just come out of UPT. I think there's like 6 or 7 of us plus or minus 2 or 3 years, and still some of my best friends. And then there's a group of active duty folks that are coming off of F-16 tours. Weapons officers, people with skill sets that we needed to kind of round out what we were doing. And then some folks that were Vietnam era A7 folks, and they're in the leadership positions. And it was a very competitive squadron. They were very proud of, the way that they did specifically bombing and strafing, because that was the primary mission of the A7. The Guard was kind of in a unique area back then. We had a lot of legacy aircraft without a lot of sustainment and modernization going into them, and slowly losing relevance. So the F-16 was a huge improvement for Buckley, and they hit the ground running and tried to be the best they could be at it. And I think that's defined that unit for a very long time. I go back and visit, and I know about 4 out of the 40 guys that are there. But I would say my impressions are, hanging out with them, talking to them, we're in good hands, whether it's, young guys at Buckley, young guys flying the F-35, they're as good or better than we were, and that they know their mission, they're talented. And, but it was a great incubator for me. And, I learned a lot while I was there.
Well, and you said it too, again, this is kind of a little sidebar, but I definitely see in the media where people are like, military, losing its edge. It's like, at least from my perspective, when I talk to thinking of fighter pilots and I got a lot of buddies who are they're the smartest dudes I've ever met, and they're the most tactical dudes I've ever met that are still out there. And so, like, if the flag ever goes up, I know there's a good crop of people that they know what they're doing, and they're best at what they do. So, I don't lose faith. And I know the Guards, I got a lot of Buckley buds myself. They have a great reputation, So,
yeah. And I was fortunate enough to, even as I ebbed and flowed, because I go back on active duty, and I do some what we call statutory tours, Title 10 Guard work, primarily in tests down in Tucson. And Buckley's still my sponsor unit, and they took such great care of me while I was there. And then after I left, I got to go on a couple Middle East deployments before I left, and then they invited me back in 2007 for OIF. Which was great, and it was really nice to go back with the same guys I grew up with, but now having been working and developing the weapons and the software and the airplanes and the tactics on the OT side, and some of it in the developmental world as well, to be able to go employ with them and get their first impressions, and it's fun, to be able to do that. So. I'm still a red eye at heart. Most folks go to that unit and never leave. It's become more acceptable, I think, now, or normalized that their leadership track folks are going to go off and do a test tour or go work at the Guard Bureau and get some staff time, because as we integrate more and more with the active component and become more and more critical to how they do their mission, you have to understand the whole process. You can't just be good at doing CAS or just be good at going to the range. So a lot of effort into maturing at least a decent percentage of the population to get that stink on them and go out and do that. So we've had 4 or 5 guys at the test center since I left, which has been fantastic. So.
Yeah, a lot to dive in there. Obviously, the Guard just can't be on its own island anymore. The good old boy flying club back, what people might have thought about it. Again, it's integrated in basically mini active duty. I would so for your career there, because obviously there's a lot of roads we can go down. But you come back to Buckley, obviously go through MQT. I imagine you're spending a few years as DSG / probably full-time orders, deployments. Let's kind of talk through that little time period before you branch off doing some testing?
Yeah, so I come back and I get a year's worth of seasoning days. So that's basically, getting MR. When I showed up, we didn't even have the AMRAAM. So I'm an old school Viper guy. First couple of years it was heaters and guns. You learn how to get skinny and wiggle to the merge, which was super fun. A lot of my contemporaries still beat their chest about how cool that was and how much better fighter pilots we were. And yeah, you had to build a mental picture, and the jet didn't do as much for you. You couldn't see as far. But knowing what I know now and seeing the F-22 and the F-35 and stuff that's coming down the pipe after that, I would take the new stuff any day, and it really frees you up to do some great work. But it was interesting, when I got there, we had some fun deployments. We went to Australia, got to go fly with the F-111 squadron down in Amberley before they disbanded, and that was pretty crazy because we were there during the Indy Grand Prix in Surfers Paradise, which is a city just down the coast from Brisbane. And I don't know if you've ever Googled that, but the Australian Air Force does these flybys, and they go in between buildings, and it's kind of insanity, but it's expected and normal. And so we get included in all that, which was right up our alley, and super fun. And every day we would come by and do this, 4-ship diamond flyby right over pit row and make a lot of noise and beat up the pattern there. And we had this formal event one night in downtown Brisbane, and we get police escorts, and we're in limos and all mess dresses and stuff. And we walk into the front of this thing, and we're walking down this long hallway to get to the banquet room, and this medium-sized guy, he's kind of skinny, comes walking up to us, and he gets down on his knees. He's wearing a tux, and he's like, I'm not worthy. And I look at the guy I'm with, and I'm like, I think that's Bobby Rahal. And Bobby Rahal, famous IndyCar racer, and he talked our arm off, and he was like, he said, well, you guys flew over, and I thought my transmission dropped out of the car. And that was like the first time when I realized, like, people actually think we're cool, and up until that point, I'm getting pummeled, being the new guy in the squadron. And so we had some really fun things. And then we did Operation Provide Comfort out of Incirlik, supposedly defending the Kurds, but then, leaving for 30 or 40 minutes of time to let the Turks come in and bomb them. That was kind of the first eye-opener of, geopolitics and, that there's a lot more going on here than just us. Ended up doing a deployment Southern Watch at Al Jaber in 96, and that's when the bomb went off in Dhahran. We weren't doing much, but after the bomb went off, it got pretty locked down. I think we had Marine escorts to get to the chow hall and to the latrine, kind of thing. And one side thing there was, I'm similar to like I think Cinco was talking about it. I did my master's work, while I was working full time, and they had this program at University of Colorado where they would send you the courses on VHS, and so for 4 or 5 years, I would take a class every semester, including the summer. So I'm deployed, and I need these tapes. And so I tell my wife, I'm like, can you FedEx them to me? Because the FedEx comes to the base, and it doesn't matter if they're like a week delayed. They give me a little bit of extra time. Well, she ended up sending them like DHL or something. And DHL went to downtown Kuwait City. And so I'm like, I don't have them. Where are they? She's like, well, here's where I sent them to, and she read off the receipt. Anyway, it turned into an armed convoy to downtown Kuwait City to try to retrieve these things. And, it went all the way up to like the CFAC and, probably going, what's this kid doing? But times are better now. You have the internet. But I made it through all those classes, and that's what ultimately got me into doing some of the test flying. So it was worth the effort.
That's the ultimate level of dedication for your master's degree.
Yeah,
on that comfort piece, kind of interesting. I think I probably can parallel too. Is like my OIR deployment. It's purely focused on helping the Kurds, not purely, but eradicate ISIS, but supporting the Kurds, YPG, YPJ. But then then it opened my eyes with what was going on with Turkey and their thoughts of the Kurds. So you got a NATO ally who won't let us get gas in their country.
Yeah.
So very dynamic, But again, I just had this soda straw. Probably, I still have a soda straw that I'm looking through.
Yeah. And it's interesting. After all these years, I'm starting to see some things that may be positively going our way. I think the administration just rescinded the F-35 offer. So at least that's what I saw in the news last week. So more to follow on that. But yeah, it's. I think it was out of necessity back then. We needed that access, but I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if they end up being good long-term partners. At Shepherd, I had 2 Turkish pilots in my class, and they were just a hoot, and we stay in touch. Great people. Nothing against Turkey or the Turks, but man, it was difficult dealing with the political situation there. So.
Yeah, I mean, as for us, it was you typically operating 30 miles from the border and then having to drive 45 minutes to get gas when you could have plopped the tanker on the other side. And wait a minute, hey, who's helping who? And then stop locking me up with your radar.
Right.
I went the same team, and actually, maybe a year after that at a red flag, because I think I'm trying to remember the coup attempt was in 2015, I believe, in Turkey, but the Turkish Air Force and their Vipers were out at red flag, had lockers next to them. So then you're like, I wonder what side, who fell on what side,
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think they had a little tussle over that for sure. So
yeah. Sorry, digress there. But I mean, that's the ultimate level of dedication when it comes to finishing your master's. 1, having to get VHS tapes, and then 2, an armed convoy going downtown. So I guess if anyone gripes about doing their master's, then
right.
Replay.
Uphill both ways in the snow. But the other thing that was going on during that time, and it was kind of interesting because I had a little bit of a space background. I got an opportunity to go be an exchange officer with the National Reconnaissance Office, and back then I couldn't even say that. And the reason is the site that I was working at was at Buckley. If you've ever flown in there, all those golf balls, but used to be supposedly all belonged to Space Command. About half of it was in our RO facility. It still is, and in 2008 they declassified that. And the Air Force post Desert Storm was trying to put some pilots, specifically fighter pilots, embedded at the National Security Agency and the NRO, because they recognized that, in the debrief after Desert Storm, that they realized there was a lot of data that the national community, national technical means had that was never disseminated. And so they put some folks in to try to look at it and go, is it useful? Is it accessible? Can we get it to where we need it to go? And how do we integrate it to make time-sensitive targeting decisions, inside the time frame where it makes a difference for the mission? And so I was barely a captain, maybe a 6-year point, and the Comac, who happened to be General Mike Lowe, his son was in our squadron. He goes on to be a 3-star in the Guard. And they came up with a funding profile for me, so I was still attached to the 120th. That's where I got my OPRs. But I spent 3 years working. My desk job was across the street. That was very interesting and eye-opening. So I worked with a group that basically did support to military operations, and I was the only pilot at a ground station. The rest of the folks were at headquarters in the DC area, kind of as a staff tour, but some very notable weapons school guys that I got to work with, which was great. And so I had 4 customers. I basically had the Middle East theater, EUCOM and CENTCOM, and we would educate them on our capabilities, really to the CFAX, and because we were adjudicating the resources, for whether you were coming out of Turkey or you're coming out of Saudi or Kuwait or somewhere else down south. And then I had Joint Special Operations Command, and I had what was called JADF South at the time, counter-drug out of Key West. I think it's JADF East. And then I had the test and evaluation ranges. And so the test and evaluation ranges use a lot of the national technical means to calibrate their systems and sensors, and that's kind of how we close loop a lot of stuff. So, and being able to do some of that work, really, that's one of the key segues for me are off ramps where I meet a bunch of people that open up doors that allow me to, progress and go on and do some of these things. So as I get picked up for test pilot school, I got people that are like, oh, we've worked with you before, either at the NRO or the operational test side. And so I was a known entity, and, that kind of paid off for kind of my career progression, which was very non-standard. So,
a couple questions.
Yeah.
Obviously, see where we go with this. What year again was this where you started working with the NRO?
I want to say 95 to 97.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was curious because, I think like 9/11 too, a lot of the stuff coming out of 9/11, obviously identifying the fact that we had a lot of stovepipes in the intelligence community, so secrets aren't getting crosstalked and collaboration. So it's pre that, but it's interesting that was the, probably the impetus and the start of it, as you kind of alluded. And so you again, I'm envisioning as like at the tactical level being there, where again, you said you had some other fighter pilot counterparts, maybe up in DC, more at the operational strategic level. I would envision too, you're kind of like looking at actually the data real time and then communicating that to the CFAC. But still, it's a pretty high level for those who aren't familiar. I mean, that's the 3-star who is in charge of the whole air component. It's not the fighter squadron or the bomber squadron or the ISR squadron in theater. So there's still a lot of layers that information has to run through to be processed or utilized at a tactical level.
Yeah, for sure.
Fair statement.
Very fair. And when we would go do education work, it was definitely at the CFAC level, or the the J2 or the A2 kind of level. But a lot of the things I did day in and day out were, we would ensure that their requirements were getting serviced, and then that data was flowing. It's typically automated, so we're not picking up the phone and saying, "Hey, boss, here's what I got today." But the focus was really, how do I get it out of those stovepipe systems and find ways to declassify it or downgrade it or put a receiver on the other end at the right level that I could get it into the squadron, or even better, we could get it into a jet. And a lot of what I did was look at data, and I would help the analysts go, here's what I think that is, because they would look at it and they didn't know, here's what I think we can do with it. And we would start to run little mini experiments. How fast can we collect certain types of information? How do we utilize it on the tactical end, and then how do we get it in that format and get it shipped out in a timely manner? And so a lot of neat things came out of that. And obviously there's much better layers now, but this was pre a lot of data link work. There was no saddle. Link 16 was in design phase, but a lot of fighters weren't flying with it. But as that stuff started to hit the shelves, we were prepared to start to do some of that stuff. So that was definitely interesting.
Yeah, I bet that was a very interesting assignment, to say the least. And as you said too, like, it alluded to a lot more opportunities down the road that ended up behind a door somewhere, which is pretty cool. So
yeah.
So in that time, you're just working for NRO. You're not flying, but obviously Buckley is paying the bill for you.
No, I'm doing both. So okay. I've been blessed. I was in the F-16 for 23 years across multiple guard and active duty tours. I didn't have a Form 8 in it. There was times where I might not have been what I would say proficient, but ended up getting over 3,000 hours flying the airplane, and I flew lots of other stuff as well as I got into the test world. But always near and dear to my heart, to stay current and proficient. So yeah, I did normal wrap tasking, and the guys were pretty flexible, so I could get over and between drill weekend and typically one dedicated full day per week. It was a 10-minute walk to get there. So the tough part was I couldn't tell anybody what I was doing, and that was back then drove not animosity is the wrong word. It was just like, what are you doing? And so the level of security and the level of information sharing across platform wasn't there back in those days. F-16 pilots had blinders on to everything that was going on in the rest of the world, and I think there probably a little bit of jealousy. But once they all figured it out, which was, I don't know, 15 years later, they're all like, "Oh, well, that's pretty cool," So, but yeah, it's my like I said, my whole career's been wacky. I got offered things that were interesting to me. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I wanted to be as good as I could be. I'm more passionate probably about operational tests than I am developmental tests, but I appreciate and enjoyed both of those sides. But being able to work on projects with really interesting people and do cool things, especially if it can help out the 18-year-old with an M16, if it can help out your brothers executing a seed mission and doing it better. Those were the things that, were interesting to me. And I spent most of my career working on those types of things. In fact, a lot of times I tell folks I worked on all the projects that no one else really wanted and then tried to polish them into something that was really useful. And people went like, okay, wow, we didn't see that coming, so.
It's super interesting. And so I would like to kind of show, because you go operational test first. Anytime I talk about test stuff, my buddy Rush, I always like to name drop him, doing DT, developmental tests. So maybe we start with kind of the little difference between those two. But I always think of like my Dash 2 questions. That's the guy who I would go to. But anyone who's not familiar with the Dash 2, at least the Viper, I'm sure every airframe, it's like jab a pin in my eye. It's like 1,000 pages of all these different options, combinations of everything in the inventory. It's like, well, it's this speed, this G limit, but if you shoot this missile off this, like everything changes. I think people probably still over G and over speed stuff, but you need to be a lawyer and an engineer to read the Dash 2, in my opinion. But
you do, and I found that stuff maybe at least interesting early on, and then the more I got into the tactical world and I realized I only had a certain number of penguins that would fit on the iceberg, I focused a lot more on the tactics for a significant chunk of my career. Very fortunate to end up at the Air National Guard Air Force Reserve Command Test Center, AATC. There's probably be an interesting podcast to get 4 or 5 of those guys in a room together, Raisin being one. He was there. We overlapped for a few weeks before I headed off to test pilot school. But that organization has done, especially in that era, just did some amazing things. They had some real core beliefs that, they summed up in a couple of statements, 80% capability at 20% of the cost, or it doesn't matter till they're using it in the field. And we lived those mantras every day. And it was unique in that we gave individual pilots, they were all very talented, but we gave them a lot of control. So you go to a test squadron active duty, whether it's developmental or operational test, and those teams typically get told what they're going to test. It's coming down from ACC, it's coming down from AFMC, it's a major program, and they're there for 2 or 3 years of it if they're lucky. And, the test plan's already built, the test schedule's already built. At AATC, we got to be the program managers. We got to get the money. We got to work on contracts. And we got to pick what we did and how we did it. And obviously there's rules, but we had some freedom to sprint when we had really good ideas. And we weren't encumbered by the budgetary cycle because we had a flying hour program that we were able to use, which was helpful. And then we had a set of funds that the ARC combined programs were called INGRIA, and it was originally designed to buy, soldiers' equipment and, backpacks and rucksacks and boots and stuff like that. And we really branched out into other things we could do with it, and that became kind of our procurement mechanism. So able to put things on airplanes very quickly, and in my first tour there, we did a lot in 2 years.
Could you give me like a 30,000 foot laydown of OT, DT, how Tucson, the 422, how Eglin, how piggybacking on FMS programs, things like that? Like, how does that all kind of work for those that aren't familiar? There's a lot of nuance that goes into all this.
Well, traditionally and legally, all developmental testing gets done in the Air Force under AFMC. We do some DT at the test center in Tucson. We have for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, but that's in partnership with the 416th Flight Test Squadron at Edwards. So we have an MOU, we have some of their pilots on exchange, and so it allows us to streamline the process, but we're not skipping it. And developmental test is really there to make sure that the stuff is safe, that we understand all that stuff that's in the -1 and -2 about flying qualities and about stores loading and what the flight control laws are doing for you and what the Cat 1 and Cat 3 switch do. They're pedantic, but at the end of the day, if we've done our job right, Rain Waters doesn't have to think about it when he gets in the jet. He just puts the switches where we tell him, and the vehicle performs, right? Operational test is the same in the test center in Tucson as it is at the 422 or the 85th. Technically, depending on program size, there's oversight from DOT&E or AFOTech. But we're doing tactics, we're doing some weapons testing and employment, and the big difference between those two is, again, the 422 and 85th Bubbas are getting told probably what they're going to test. Maybe if they've come back for a second tour, they were on the tactics conference, 3 or 4 years ago that says, hey, we need something like this, and they get to go do it. But largely, they're there for a part, if very rarely all of a given program's life cycle. Contrary to that, test center folks go there and camp out for 8 or 10 years and can really start something and see it through and see some of the revisions. And so you gain a lot of traction, and more importantly, you have the history of where you've been, which really helps inform, where you want to go when you're going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yep.
I got your bio and kind of notes pulled up here with just some of the testing that you were a part of with the AL-213, ALE-50, MALD, AR-69, jamming pods, TARS, DEED. I mean, a whole slew of things that are integral to today and things that are happening in the F-16. I'd like to kind of talk through some of those. I mean, one, this time period, probably leading into it, being a Viper guy, you're like, well, hey, we're going to get center pedestal, AESA radar, integrated defensive suite, because, my simple brain running a jamming pod, I can do a program, and if I can figure out the right buttons to press, depending on what controller unit is in there that's all worn out, that's a win for me for that day. But switching programs mid-flight, like the Iceberg is not big enough for me. But that was one big push originally, I think, probably, the late or 2010 to 13 timeframe, and got squashed. And now the Viper's getting, obviously they're being modified with AESA, new jamming pods, et cetera. But that was a big part too. Were you part of that testing to bring in this integrated system where, it sees the enemy, the fighter control radar out there, it can squirt the right, stuff out the front?
Yeah, so we actually built that system. The ALQ-213 did all of that, and we started that in 98. I got there in 99. But basically integrated your RWR, your jammer, your dispenser suite. To make better decisions, we came up with a software that was embedded called TRP, Threat Response Processor. So it would know, hey, if I see this particular threat on the RWR, I need to be in this particular pod mode. Or if I'm jamming, I want to, in theory, I can remove the my own emissions from my own RWR scope and maybe declutter it, things like that. And that system grows over time. We end up doing, basically non-traditional flares, covert flares, forward firing kinematic flares. We put AAR-47 on the A-10. We build a virtual training range similar to like what Raptor and F-35 have, where you can have an embedded training mode. So we had VEX, Virtual Electronic Combat Training System, and that was back in my second tour in 07, 08. And we got those across the A-10 and across the F-16. Even a little side project that we did on the AT-6 had all that. So that was kind of the start and the foray into that. But what you're seeing now is the next level above that. So I know there's some integrated iViews, and there's another system I think that's One's Northrop, one's L3. But they're standing on the shoulders of stuff that we did before, and from all accounts I hear, it's pretty great stuff. And eventually we made the pitch that the 213 and everything migrate over to the Block 40 and 50 fleet, because it was 10 years delayed, and you guys were still doing ALE 47 and having to flip all the switches, which didn't make a lot of sense in a high threat environment.
It didn't seem like it was going to work out well.
Yeah. Thankfully, most of our wars didn't require it. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, it's crazy. I think just in the last 5 or 6 years, how fast everything, what from not only the threats and recognition of the threat laydown has changed, but what is coming to the forefront for the warfighter and the capability is pretty impressive. Just how fast that's being fielded, which is pretty cool. It's completely changed games since I stopped doing it. So.
Yeah, and it's added so much complexity. Test is all about you're predicting what results you're going to get, going out and testing it. Does the predictions match? If it doesn't, what did we miss? Let's go update our sims. Let's update our models. And when you add complicated software and things like AES or radar processing, that's what takes all the time these days. Even in the civilian programs that I've worked at, like Gulfstream and at Regent, they're heavily software-based platforms. And I know you've talked about it a few times. Just the delays in F-35 for getting TR3 and some of those things out the door. It's tough, and it's not the fun, sexy first flight stuff that a lot of us who went into developmental tests wanted to go do. We didn't want to do the Dash 2 writing. We wanted to be able to do a first flight on a new vehicle, do something that's at the edge of our capability limits today. But really, we're typically slowed down by software and how long it takes to mature and make sure that it's safe and does everything it's supposed to do. Because all it takes is one erroneous line of code to get unlocked at some point, and somebody's having a bad day.
So, working with a vendor that has developed, widget X, Y, or Z, and the software that works with it, or developing it. Again, because my understanding too, for a while, like the Guard, hey, we are changing something, we can write the code and change the code and squirt the jets really quickly. Active duty, for the longest time, it would just wait to the next cycle to get reworked and done. I mean, in your opinion, is there a better way or a faster way or is that even a roadblock today? Like, Company X develops a widget, getting that software integrated into the whole, like, who oversees that, get it integrated into the aircraft? And if we need to make a change, do you have to go back, because it's proprietary software, can we own it, et cetera? And let alone, like you've already alluded to, is like one line of code could be wrong and just trash the whole thing. Like, it's very complex, but are those roadblocks still there today? Like, is there a better way around it? What are we facing?
Yeah, I think everything you mentioned still exists. I think it's program specific and relationship specific. The reason why the test center at Tucson could do things quickly is because we were a legacy system. We were able to get our OFP suite moved under the supervision and work authority of the folks at Ogden. So we had GS employees working on it. They had some great young kids, and we'd go out and buy them pizza and beer and cocktail napkin up a PVI improvement or a new candidate, and they'd have a prototype ready in the morning, and it was just, they were motivated, and there's no business model that the middlemen that have to get involved. I'm sure some of their bosses were not happy with them being like, oh, that's easy, because somebody's got to manage the breadth and depth of the whole effort and make sure you deliver on time and on budget, regardless of how you do it. But with Lockheed and Northrop and Boeing, they're businesses. They're there to make a profit and take care of their shareholders, and so you got to account for that in your fielding process. And Brazen talked a little bit about it. He's very entrepreneurial. Test center folks in general, we're all entrepreneurial. Trying to find ways to do stuff faster and cheaper it needs to be important, and I think the DoD's going there now. And it doesn't mean we're still not going to have F-47, Cat 1 programs, B-21. We need those, but I'd love to see the chart of life cycle costs for a platform versus the numbers of DIMPs that they serviced, right? And what the cost per DIMP was. You know, B2 takes out some stuff in Iran, and I know they've done some other good work out there. Great platform, love that community. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's a very expensive platform, not many of them. And if you only drop 2, you know, MOPS, what's the cost if all in to deliver that weapon on that given day? And so you got to be willing to pay that. And then you look at, you know, what's going on in the Ukraine, and you got some very asymmetric stuff with, you know, drones and counter drone, very low cost, you know, $1,000 a DIMP, maybe $500 a DIMP. So I think we're going to need to do both. And, you know, in my mind, quantity is a quality all of its own. And, you know, if we've got a whole bunch of super high-end resources, even if they're perfect and well-tested, you know, and China can throw up, you know, 1,000 F-7s, you know, and they can attrit them all because they don't care, then to me that's, you know, that's a challenging problem. And so I think we've got to get out of our own way a little bit and do some more asymmetric work. And we have tons of people that know how to do it. We just need to empower them to go do it and let the system carve out a niche for them to operate in. And I think that's going to happen.
I think it has to happen. I mean, I agree. And it's a very interesting topic. Obviously, we've talked about it on the podcast a good bit. I'm interested in it. I'm sure you're interested in it. Like, we're all kind of looking at seeing how fast the battle space is changing. You know, I mean, you used to march in a line, and then all of a sudden someone invented a machine gun, and that wasn't, or, you know, just a rifle, and that wasn't a good thing anymore.
Right.
But the drones, how fast that has come off, and we're obviously seeing it play out in Ukraine with, you know, these FPV drones that just never before type seen footage. That, again, I think the quantity is the quality of all of itself. That's said quite a bit, but there's some truth to it. And if you're slinging, for lack of a better phrase, exquisite missiles at, you know, $1.5 million a pop that you can't just print off in a day, how fast and how often can you do that? So there's a lot of demands on our military industrial complex to produce these things. But when it comes to like the F-47, for instance, you said we kind of have to do them both. And I mean, I would agree with that. How do we navigate that? You know, for those who haven't been following the NGAD, the Next Generation Air Dominance fighter discussion, F-47, you know, it's like you have to get it right because you're building an exquisite piece of technology that, again, our procurement process is not that fast. And if you procure this platform, it takes 15 years or however long it takes. And again, as fast as technology is evolving, if it doesn't answer that threat 15 years from now or can't adapt to it, like, we just wasted all this money. And again, cost per DIMP, desired point of impact, how much money do we spend? Are we ever going to use it? How do we navigate this? What's Coma's thoughts on it?
Yeah, you know, I think those platforms that are going to survive and meet the end state cost and performance goals, you know, you're seeing, you know, when you say 10 or 15 years, you're seeing the top of the iceberg. There's teams that have been doing, you know, looking at lots of technologies, whether it's at DARPA, whether it's at Air Force Research Labs, and there's a lot of maturation that goes on there before we ever even commit. That needs to continue, you know, and that's how you pick the right things and pick the right pony, pick the right things to put on the pony. But we do need to figure out a faster way to award a contract, get the prototypes built and get them fielded. And honestly, the thing that scares me the most in that whole process is not materials, you know, not, you know, propulsion, even though those things can be problematic. It's software, right? And it's how do you make your software, especially the mission system side, robust very quickly and do all the integration work. So because all these platforms are integrated, right? Every sensor, every actuator, everything's on the bus. And so you got to make sure all that software works, and then thermal, right? A lot of these airplanes generate a lot of heat because you got all these processors and actuators, and you got to be able to get rid of it. And those, like as a test guy, those are like when I look at programs, that's the stuff that it's not sexy, but those are typically the hard problems to solve. And you know, when I was at Edwards, you know, Raptor was just finishing up DT, getting ready to go into OT, and you know, they put fuel in a you know, refrigerated fuel in the truck and put it in the vehicle because it was over temping, just getting to get airborne. So a lot of heroics there, and I think they've eventually figured all that stuff out. But yeah, I don't know that there's a correct answer, but I think some of our own, I think it's like a lot of things, the policy creep, we become less efficient as government organizations, and to me that's the area that we should tackle, because there's probably 10 or 20% that we can reduce in terms of cost and in terms of time, which at the end of the day will be significant.
You hit on software. I'm not a software guy, but as seeing just how fast things are changing too. I mean, I imagine a big challenge, like Ogden, if that's run by GS employees, and it's the young guys and gals who get those GS positions, which, knowing the GS pay scale, it's not going to compare to Silicon Valley, et cetera.
Right.
How do we get the right talent in the right spots to be able to handle these programs that we need done, to be responsive and do that? I mean, to me, that seems like a very large problem set in and of itself. Yeah.
One of the things I think that attracts folks to some of these programs is the cool factor, right? So, I can go work on an app in Silicon Valley and get paid triple, but I can touch a B-21 at my lunch break, right? And we see that out of a lot of kids. They're patriotic. They like working with the operators. And people will take less money. It doesn't mean we should exploit them, but I think that's what's keeping the reserves, in the talent pool intact for those types of activities. And to me that may be incentive enough. AI is going to be the next thing that's going to come to play. A lot of the grunt coding can be, the code libraries and the artificial intelligence to look at your code or pull some code in to do what you need it to do and do it right the first time is very close to being there if it's not there already. And so I think some of the workload is going to get reduced, and maybe it takes less people. And so maybe for the supervisors of all that, to make sure the processes are right and the end product's correct, maybe they're making a lot more money because AI can take on the work of 5 coders that make $75,000 a year or $100,000 a year. So, and in all honesty, you look at, just over the last 6 months, Silicon Valley's shedding a lot of talent. I think, some economic reckoning, but also kind of a realization that AI is coming out pretty quick, and nobody wants to be caught flat-footed with too much staff and not be able to leverage their AI to the max extent practical. So I think those will all be factors in how that works going forward.
Yeah, well, that was a good digression. I think we've now made it to you going to test pilot school. So you got an operational test down in Tucson, and you applied test pilot school, go to TPS. What was TPS like?
It was awesome. It's, for airplane nerd like me, kids in the candy store, I love being tactical. When I first got test center, I had 4 or 5 422 and weapons school IPs that were my big brothers, and they kept me very tactical there, and they groomed me to go to weapons school. And in the Guard, about that time, they changed the mantra from best qualified to, hey, we got a lot of units that don't have a weapons officer, so it was going to be 50% unit need for your score and 50% your skill set. And Tom Swanson, who was our Guard A3, was like, Coma, you're going to get a 0 for unit need. And I go, dang, because I came from Buckley and they had 5 or 6 kick-ass weapons officers. And then I'm at Tucson, it's 100%. I'm the only non-weapons officer. So I felt like I kind of went through my own mini WIC there. They let me lead. They were tough but fair. And it just wasn't going to happen. And I probably could have moved to, some other Guard units, but Guard's already tough sell coming in as a weapons officer during that era, kind of set in their ways maybe a little bit, and especially a unit where they didn't pick you. So so my boss said, hey, you interested in going to test pilot school? And I go, well, Guard guys don't go to TPS. And he's like, well, let's get in a jet and fly over there and talk to them. And so Dave Brubaker was our boss there at Test Center. He ends up being interim director of the Air National Guard after 9/11. Great guy, and very motivated entrepreneur. We fly a D model out to Edwards, and we march up to the flight test center two-star general's office. He's like, I want Coma to go to test pilot school. And they're like, no. And at this point, we're headbutting with them because they see all the cool things we're doing down in Tucson, and maybe some jealousy, but also some concerns about lines of authority. And they're like, we're not going to give you a developmental test pilot to take more business from us. Was basically the reading between the lines. And so we tuck our tails between our legs and we head out. And it turns out there was a staff officer in there, this guy named Alford, and he was the board organizer for AFMC A3. And I got back to Tucson and he called me and he's like, hey man, would you come back on active duty? And he's like, we scored your resume and you'd be like in the top couple of guys in our upcoming class. And I go, yeah. I never was, sure, I'll pay back. So quick story, and end up getting selected. And then I have to do a return to active duty board. So TPS has picked me up, but now I have to get the Air Force to say I'm worthy to come back on active duty. and my wife, who is a F-16 flight doc finishing up med school, she has to get picked for her residency. And so we're trying to coordinate all this stuff to get to the same place at the same time. And my board announces the day after she has to put in her match for residency location. And so we like, hey, we're trying to go together. And she had an option out in LA. And they were kind of being jerks about it. I don't know if it was AFMC A3 or if it was Randolph. But they go, well, we can't tell you, but tell your wife to go to Los Angeles. So they were cool. And she got her thing in at like 11:59 that night. And then the next day the list came out and we ended up out there. And I had a great class, 24 of us total. About 5 or 6 fighter pilots, some heavy guys, Wizzo, some foreigners, a bunch of engineers, and we had a blast. We, studied hard, played hard, very social group. We still get together a fair amount, and got to fly tons of cool airplanes. B-17, notable for me. We did this project in a 707. You do what's called a test management project, TMP. And you get assigned to it. And so we get this old 707, which is called Speckled Trout, and it's the chief's airplane, and it lives at Edwards, but he can take it and, when he's traveling to Europe or whatever, and it's got some special comm gear on it. But it's got a HUD, and they're trying to figure out how to do, at night, blacked out, spiral down approaches, kind of the Sarajevo approach overhead of field for these heavies, getting into runways without being, dragging in low and slow over the outer fence line and getting shot down. And so we get this test, and so we come up with the highway in the sky technology. We're working with some folks in industry up at Stanford, and we basically plot out low-level routes with a set of continuously moving containers in the HUD that you keep the flight path marker in, and then one that sets us up for, no kidding, an SFO to land, at some power setting, flap and gear. And we put polarizing film on the windscreen, so we couldn't see out wearing polarized glasses. And so we're just flying off this HUD, daylight, and we got a safety pilot in the right seat. And it was a hoot, and we learned a lot. But the biggest funny thing that came out of it, it was almost traumatic, but this was a year after 9/11, and we're flying 707 at 400, 500 feet at 300 knots. Up and down the different valleys around Edwards, and we end up cresting a ridge, and we're trained, following, hand flying it, just east of or just west of like the I-15 corridor coming out of LA, and we set off a lot of people's radar, and people are like, "What's this jet doing?" I mean, we looked like a threat, and so we've got like 1,000 phone calls in the LA basin that day that. Some 707 or some airliner had been hijacked and was running down the road. So we were famous for a couple of days. But cool stuff like that. And got to go fly a whole bunch of airplanes over in the UK. Got to fly the Jaguar. Was super cool. And Buzz Stonehenge and Madonna's house and all kinds of cool shit. And it was great. And the program is. And was what you need it to be. It really gives you just soup to nuts. I mean, we did everything from helicopters to gliders to propeller-powered airplanes, big jets, C-17s, B-52s, you know, all the way through all the fighters. Got to go fly with the Navy. I think we flew like 30 airplanes that one year. And
a lot of that too, like when you, hey, like Coma, tomorrow's your Raptor day, you're gonna fly the F-22. They'll give you maybe a cheat sheet as far as like the highlights of how not to kill yourself, how to start it, and then it's like on you to go study and figure it out.
Yeah, and so you have to figure out what's most important. The big airplanes were the toughest because just getting them started and how the chocks was hard. With the fighters, it was more about, you know, what am I going to do with this? What mission points am I going to look at? What PVI do I need to know? But yeah, it was like Cinco said, you know, you might get just a couple of days. A couple of them I had maybe a week. And like him, we were the first class the A-10 had been on a moratorium for a long time. And I got a chance to go back to Tucson where I just left from with the test center. And, you know, couple sims and a day of academics, and went and flew. And it was Horner, which is Chuck Horner's son, was the DO of the squadron. And he's like, "You're from around here, aren't you?" And I'm like, "Yep." I was just over at the test center. He's like, "All right, let's go." And so we just raged, you know, a couple 100 feet low level, line abreast, which I think he was supposed to chase me, but he knew I knew where I was going, and, you know, got to drop, you know, I don't know, 6 or 12 BDUs and shoot the gun. And it's a great confidence builder that you can go do that and actually even be effective in it. And but yeah, they don't give you a whole lot of time. It's a test pilot school is a time management exercise, but I think weapon school is probably the same. You know, a lot of that.
So out of that, what was the best plane you flew, and what was the worst one?
You know, from a flying qualities perspective, it's actually one in the same airplane.
We can add a cool one too if you need to.
It's cool. It's cool, and it was the most fun, but it was the worst flying airplane that I think I flew that year, and that's the F-4. And all my Vietnam era buds, when they see this, are gonna poke me. But you know, in the folks that flew the F-4 in Vietnam Desert Storm, they loved it because they had 5 or 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 hours in the airplane, and at anything over 500, you become the flight control system, you know. But for a newbie jumping in it, you know, when you taxi out, the stick just kind of limply falls over in your lap because there's a artificial fuel system that's pneumatically powered that doesn't take full effect until you're going down the runway at like 60 or 80 knots, and there's air coming in this pitot tube that goes to it. And, you know, it's sloppy. You fly with your feet, you know, at slow speed. You can't put aileron in. But somehow they got us 2 F-4Gs that were QFs at Holloman, and myself and another guy in my class, also a Viper guy, Strike Eagles before that. And we go out and we get to do BFM, you know, F4V, F4 with 2 pilots who are the guys that launch the drones and fly them in the back seat. And these guys had tons of time, but man, they had huge cojones to let us do what we did. And I didn't realize how little they couldn't see, you know, in the back. And so anyway, we got a lot out of that. We write a report, you know, and Test Pilot School always uses the F4 as like the classic case of everything on that airplane was added after they designed it to fix some problem. And it's a high workload airplane, and it's doesn't have great flying and handling qualities, but in the hands of a highly competent, you know, warrior, you know, in Vietnam, it could do miraculous things. So I appreciate the heritage. You learn a huge lesson. And you know, and you throw people like that fly those types of airplanes, even airliners, put them in an F-16, they think it's really sensitive and that it ratchets and roll. And you and I know that, yeah, you notice that for a sortie or two and then it goes away. And I've always had a hard time going back and forth between flying like a Boeing 707 or, you know, some of the older Gulfstreams and then going into the digital stuff, because you have to get your gains up and you have to put a lot more little small inputs in that might not take effect while you're watching it, but you got to take them out before you see what you want. And so compensation skills you got to learn there to be successful.
Yeah, a little bit of nuance to
for sure.
Yeah.
But and some of those, like I said, some of I mean, the pilot, those guys were all pilots. The further to our spectrum you get, we're more systems operators. We've made the airplanes purposefully fly really, really well, so you can focus on the mission, right? Because you're trying to manage 3 radios and save the 18-year-old on the ground. You need brain bites to do that. So,
yeah, absolutely, making it simple for the pilots so you can
yeah,
run all the widgets. Again, I got bio pulled up here. This is after test pilot school, so it looks like obviously integration with the Lightning pod on the B-52, JDAM support, JHEMIX, the midlife upgrade program, Israeli Block 16 upgrade, auto GCAS,
yep.
And also teaching the departure and in-flight engine shutdown course in the Viper. Oh, and also the HTS pod as well. So just again, like a few systems. Obviously, again, very relevant today and integral to how we go out there and fly. What, I mean, I guess if you actually the spin program too, like I'm curious about all of these things. Is there one particular one that was super challenging to you, very interesting to you, or that you walk away with the feather in your cap? This was awesome, or is it all?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I love the most at Edwards, all my jobs I think would be summed up with really good people taking care of me and me getting a chance to help them as well. The people at the 416th were fantastic, and I was only there 18 months. And I was, and because I went to test pilot school a little late, I was in my primary zone for 05, and they needed to put me in the ops officer job or something like it, cleaning up some old guard paperwork that was funny, but not passing muster for active duty. So I pretty much did a touch and go, but getting to fly the departure rides, and not just for training, that was fun. I really enjoyed working with other Viper pilots to show them, the envelope, show them some deep stalls, maybe a yaw departure if we could get there. But going out and actually testing configurations to make sure we knew it was safe to give to the operator. So I got to work the HTS-R7 Lightning pod or Sniper pod dual carriage. So now you move the R7 over to the left side of the intake, and you have the Sniper pod on the right. And anything that's forward of the CG and even the centerline tank can be pretty destabilizing in yaw, as well as asymmetric missiles. So if you've shot two off one side and not off the other, and so we misconfigure them sometimes with correct missiles and just the pods up front, sometimes just with asymmetric missiles. But we go down and do what's called slow down turns, and so you're up at 40,000 feet. And you're doing 300 knots, 0.8 Mach something, and maybe 350, maybe even 400, and you'll roll and pull. And what happens is, and you know this because being the demo guy, but your flight path depresses really to basically what your AOA on the jet is. So your flight path's going out the bottom of the jet. And what happens is the airflow gets disturbed going over the upper surface of the vehicle, and that's where the rudder is. And the Viper's pretty good digital flight controls wise, but if the rudder gets blanked at a high AOA, higher G pole up at altitude, there's not enough dynamic pressure going over the rudder to give you yaw control. And so you can get this really wicked side-loaded yaw departure, slap your head up against the side of the canopy, and it's a e-ticket ride for sure. And so we go up. We expect it to do it for this case because of the destabilizing effects. Sure enough, it does it. And I think I sent you some video that's got some pretty good clips on it. If it's in there if you want to throw that up at some point. But it's really easy to get out of. You let go of the stick, 99% of the time that'll work. Otherwise, hit the MPO and just hold it because you'll get full differential tail and it'll roll you out of it. But it'll catch your attention and it's fun, right? And it's exciting. And we fix it by placarding it as a Cat 3 loadout. And it was funny, segue, because we're operational and test pilots meet. So, when I'm growing up, guys, the weapons school guys are like, I don't use that Cat 3. I want all the AOA all the time, And I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't really appreciate, the things that they were taking on. And if you're flying a clean jet symmetric, I'm not telling anybody to go do it, but it's probably going to be okay. But if you have an asymmetric missile, or you have an asymmetric pod, or you have pods out front, you can get Mr. Toad's Wild Ride pretty easy. And I get back from Edwards. I'm at Tucson the second time, and a pretty famous fighter pilot, you probably know his name, but I won't embarrass him here. But he goes out, and we're chasing missile shots out of Tyndall, AMRAAM, and he's got a special data instrumentation pod, which is like on Station 2, but it's big. It looks like ACAP pod or whatever, if you've seen it. And I'm at the ops desk. I'm not the soft, but I'm just kind of sitting there coming back from lunch. And I'm listening to the comm, and they're setting up the missile shot, and all of a sudden I hear, knock it off, knock it off, knock it off. And then, one of the other guys is like, so-and-so departed. And then you hear him come back, and he's like, I'm good, and they're like, okay, we're knocking it off for RTB coming back in. And I'm like, what's he flying with? And they say, oh, he's got this data pod. I'm like, ask him where the switch was for Cat 1 or Cat 3. And everybody looks at me like I've grown a horn, and because they were doing a dynamic shot, so they were maneuvering, and it was up high. And sure enough, he's like, oh, yeah, it's in Cat 1. I'm like, that's your problem. You guys keep testing if you want. But anyway, it will bite you. And it's really just blanking of the tail, and it's prevalent at high altitude, like 35,000, 45,000 feet, where you don't have, there's not fat enough to generate the yaw rate you want. So that's the fun stuff. But yeah, I got to do, and I'll save one of the stories for later, but just some fun stuff there. So great people.
Yeah, well, I obviously was more sensitive to it doing demo, and more aware of it early on. I definitely was not aware of it doing in the sim, and I read one thing in the dash too about asymmetric missiles. I think maybe I probably asked the question, but I scoffed it off, right? But now I didn't know it was the rudder blinking. But I did think about it. I was like, well, yeah, I don't know what missile's coming off which station, or at least I'm not thinking about it when I'm trying to sort my two and shoot my two. I'm slinging AMRAAMs and maybe a 9X, but like where it's coming off. And then when I do my out maneuver, I'm like, when you did it out, now if you have asymmetric missiles, depending on your speed, it's like, yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine.
And if you're going out and down low under 25,000, you probably have enough dynamic pressure there. So
I'm not saying I ignored the note, but I didn't think about the note too much when I was slinging missiles in the sim there. So, I skipped over AIM 120D there as well. But the conformal fuel tanks, that's an interesting one. Oman and the Greeks added those after the fact, correct? And so unlike the Block 60, where those are integrated, that was integrated at Lockheed in the Block 60 build, correct? But the Oman and the Greeks added that after the fact. What was the play in there? Why don't we have conformals in that?
Yeah, so the theory was you add a bunch of extra fuel. The conformal tanks didn't have a lot of drag on them, and so you could extend the range of the F-16. And I never stuck around to see the end of the program, but early on in it, we had some sensitivities laterally. If you put in a little bit of Dutch roll, hit the rudder pedals a little bit, it would wobble. And we thought maybe the aerodynamic nature of that was driving it a little bit. And the other thing we saw was you didn't increase the wing area, right? It's the Oman or the Greek F-16, and they basically attach these blivets up top. So you've got more weight, same wing area, so your AOA for any given speed has to go up. Right. So, and with increased AOA, you have increased drag, increased fuel flow, and I think we were flying some pretty heavy configurations, but it appeared to me, and I haven't seen this in data, but that it was almost taking as much fuel as you added to maintain same conditions. So it's like it was a net zero at the end of the day, and they continue with the program. So I am sure that is not the end state of the program. That there's other configurations, or maybe the speeds we were flying were at maybe the worst case. We were trying to do air refueling with it, and we did notice it was a little more challenging to air refuel, and this was pre them adjusting any flight control laws or anything. So, but yeah, it's everybody wants to go further. Everybody wants more gas. Or go juice, on some airplanes, obviously it works really well, like the Strike Eagle EX. So, but I unfortunately I got a couple of quick looks at it, and then I was basically out the door. So.
Well, you said, yeah, you're out the door because, again, you're kind of at that 05 level, but you do a data mass assignment after that.
Yeah, I do. I finish up OPSO, and then I disappear for 4 years and pick up Squadron Command and get to work on some neat stuff. Someday maybe we'll do another one, write a book. Yeah. But again, just great people taking care of me, and a lot of fun.
So when you come out of that data mass assignment, what are you getting? I see, again, a whole slew from the R210, AT6, Hellfires.
Yeah, so I go back to the test center, and my weapons officer from Buckley is now the test center commander, a guy named John Mooney, and super tactical, great leader. And I swear he's got my 5-year ADSC marked on his calendar, because he calls me and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm getting ready to go to joint staff and school, And he's like, "I need you back here ASAP." And so I punch out of the active duty for the second time, go back to the test center, and get to work on all kinds of cool stuff. Trick out the A-10, work Scorpion with the team, ARC-210, which was a big deal because that gave us the ability to talk in the broad barrage jamming that was going on in Iraq at the time. I get to go back to Iraq with OIF during the surge, which is where I meet Trip Raymond and flying with Buckley. And just a fantastic deployment. And but yeah, we got to work on all kinds of stuff. And that tour went from 07 to 11 when I went off to Virgin Galactic, and I became basically a part-timer. We worked some really cool stuff. We did F-16 lead laser guidance and all the algorithms for moving target, and we were dropping inert, GBU paveway 2s through hoods of moving trucks out on the range, just with no boom, and you could just totally take them out. Some really neat things. Small diameter bomb. We got somewhere in there, it may have been after 11, we got a Erst prototype. Some guys, some great folks on the team did the center display unit, which was all color. And I worked really hard with our ALQ-213 team to put a sensor fusion engine in the 213. So, because we had multiple sensors and we had multiple data links, and we ended up with just too many tracks on the scope, and wanted to clean them up. And we knew 5 things from 5 different sources, and we needed to merge them all into one. And so it was more correlation than sensor fusion, but it was really designed to clean up the scope so we could kind of have some track management capability. And that was an interesting software project. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, just that concept alone. I mean, I imagine as we just bolt more sensors onto this piece, again, the data management piece, again, not to overwhelm the pilot and give high fidelity, process the data based on how trustworthy it is, and then actually correlating it to nearest threat, et cetera, et cetera. It's not an easy thing to slice.
No, it was cool, and some really smart folks at Georgia Tech Research Institute helped us out with all that, and I've worked with them over my whole career. Just a fantastic team and smart people. And one of the interesting things we found there is we got so good at this track correlation that we started to find out that our radar tracks were biased because we had hyper accurate data from, let's say, like the targeting pod. And we went back and looked at it, and the bore side of the antenna, which on the F-16 for the Block 30 was manually glued on, was off by 4 or 5 degrees. And so we could tell you which jets were good and which jets weren't good just by comparing them to our high quality sensors in flight. And so you think back to when we started flying in the mid 90s, we would sling BDUs and stuff like that. It's because the radar was our only ranging source. And if the bore sight was wrong, it might look like the pipper's on the target, but it's ranging something, 10 degrees off axis, 1,000 yards away or whatever. So anyway, so just some really interesting stuff. Being a test pilot for me comes down to 2 things. We're all control freaks. We want to make sure the thing does what we want it to do when we want it to do it, and that's flight controls of a pod, controls of a radar. And then it's all about database decisions, right? Because I like to say without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And opinions are good. We, as test pilots, we take in a lot of opinions and we find ways to score them. But getting data is very helpful, and that's the other cool thing that's happening with all the data analytics going on, not just in DoD but in industry. We're able to leverage old things and almost make them new again. I've been hearing ideas like getting old airplanes out of the boneyard and putting some updated servos and control mechanisms and things like that, and being able to maybe do a mini CCA, the Collaborative Combat Aircraft thing, but maybe not throw all these old things out, turn them into scrap metal. They might actually have some value if we approach it a different way. And folks have called it like jailbreaking our old systems, whether they're tanks or trucks or whatever. If you, again, getting your DIMPY cost per DIMPY down by doing something like that, it might be really neat. So and Test Center and that Epic, really got good at looking at a lot of data. So a lot of these things that we were able to do were, just new ways of looking at an old problem, and having software folks that could hang with us and deliver that capability pretty quick.
Coma, the more we talk, I feel like we're gonna have to do a part 2 here. I want to be respectful of your time, but yep. Again, we're scratching the surface here of just all these different things that you've had your hands on over the years, and again at a very kind of a high level, but very fascinating to me, because we just now kind of going into the opening with Virgin Galactic, but you're moving on with your guard career, becoming an 06, becoming a wing commander. You got commands, data mass assignments in there, working for 12th Air Force. There's a lot to kind of still dive into. Yeah. I kind of looking back, and I guess the phase 2 after the data mass assignment, is there one particular piece that you're super challenging or you're very proud of that you think we should dive into?
Yeah, but it's a big topic, and that's light attack. So I spent probably the 2 years before I went to Virgin Galactic, I spent working on the light attack program, and we could save maybe some of that for another day. But that was on the back of a napkin design with a couple of us from the test center and a couple of really smart former Air Force, one Navy pilot from Beechcraft, where we basically took everything that we had just worked on and perfected across the fleet. The ALQ-213, the AAR-47, the Scorpion HEMTT, the ARC-210, laser rockets were in progress, the A-10C KICU, which is basically the mission computer, and the SMIS, and we put it all on a T6, and we put a big motor in there, and went and had a lot of fun with that, and got to shoot 50 cals with tracers. Just some crazy, almost World War II-esque stuff. There's some tape out there of a couple of us giggling because we were having so much fun going through that process. But that program really just showed, what's in the art of the possible with maybe technology that wasn't on everybody's, bingo card for that year. And it's not necessarily a panacea, but if you're fighting a war where you have no air threat, and again, you want to service DMPIs at the lowest cost possible, stuff like that, I think, should be, considered. And I think that's one of the other things that's going to help us, is that we look at ways to leverage that asymmetry between cost and how much software we have to do, and how the time frame it takes to deliver, and then find solutions that work. And there's people out there with great ideas. It's just we typically don't palm for them when we're trying to pay F-35 bills. So, but I love that for that purpose. It ended up not getting picked up by the Air Force. I got to evaluate the AT-802. I got to fly it as well. Right. I flew the Super Tucano. When I was at 12th, I ended up going down to the Dominican Republic and teaching them how to fly NVGs and do intercepts in the Super T. So I got a little bit of spectrum there, but that was a fun project because it was a whole airplane. We'd redoing the whole thing and going through that.
Well, what is your thoughts on that? I've talked about it with like the newsletter, because obviously the Sky Tractor, I call it Dusty Prop Hoppers, made it into the Oklahoma National Guard for SOCOM. I imagine there's a lot of politics and funding. I would, and again, I'm making an assumption, the cost per unit from an AT6 to a Super Tucano to a Sky Tractor, I mean, I would think is about the same.
Yeah.
I've never flown a Sky Tractor. I've flown a T6 without all the weight added to it. And I know you can I think the T6B model, they bumped out the horsepower an extra like 600, something like that. So a little bit more power. But so uncontested environments, wherever you might need to operate, support special operations forces, et cetera, there's a niche for it. How do you compare AT6, Super Tucano, and then the Sky Tractor, Sky Raider 2?
Yeah, pretty simple actually. I think AT6 had at the time, and they may be totally different today, but AT6 had much better integration, and that was really the piece of the pie that Test Center brought to that. We had all the toys and all combat proven. So in terms of the systems you would expect to have on there, that was great. You also had a supply chain that existed inside the U.S., obviously because T6 already existed. A lot of commonality. For almost everything on the vehicle you could find on the shelves somewhere inside the logistics system. And then on the Super Tucano, a little bit beefier, a little more bare bones, but at the time it was considered better off surface. Had a little higher prop clearance, beefier gear, beefier tires. I think we did some off-field stuff, dirt runways and stuff with the T6, but the Marines and the Army wanted us to go to some of these fobs that might have a big boulders in the way, furrowed fields, things like that. And then AT802 was really designed for the off-field. You could put big tires on it, all that stuff. But with that comes the handling qualities, right? You got to have somebody who flies tailwheel and is good at it. That airplane, I was about a 1,000-hour tailwheel pilot when I went and evaluated it, and it was a handful. Very easy to, snap roll. It had a lot of torque. Very easy to have a ground handling accident, landing, without the nose tracking the right way and all your crosswind controls appropriately applied. So I'm interested to see if the AFSOC or SOCOM guys really like it in a couple of years. I know they've reduced the buy in the short run, but they're all trucks. You can put stuff on them. You can do some integration. I think Super T and T6 were more natural in terms of their cockpit layout and how you would interact with systems than the Air Tractor. And then the Air Tractor obviously has the tail wheel considerations to deal with. But again, if you can save money and get ISR and put warheads on foreheads at a low cost, I'm all for trying it. I think if you've got that operational requirement, you should look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would like to just talk about the Gulfstream time span as well as Regent, and then we really haven't touched on music yet either. Just if you're willing to, we kind of talk a little bit about your civilian test pilot flying, what you're doing today, a little music. If you're willing to hang around for There I Was, that'd be great. But again, I think we're going to have to talk as well.
I got you. I appreciate it. I apologize. I had too much material, but so I
the point of it.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. When I retired from the Air Force, and I actually retired from active duty in 2015 out of 12th Air Force, working for Bob Rand and Magoo Walters, and that was a fun assignment. Tell you some more stories about that at some point. But I got asked by the 162nd Wing, which is over where the test center is at the International Airport. I should say the test center's at their wing. They needed a vice wing commander for a year, and so I had gotten hired by Delta and was getting ready to go through training, and so I came back on active duty. Not on active duty. I came back under a thing called Letter of Indispensability. It's a weird tool in the ARC quiver that if you've retired, they can bring you back, and it's not a money-making thing. It's a paperwork nightmare. So for every day that you come in and work, you get your drill pay, but you lose your active duty retirement. And so it's an accounting nightmare. But they needed some help. I had done some flying with them when I was at the test center, and also when I was at Virgin Galactic, I was RTUIP. I believed in the mission. Again, a very talented team. That's probably the hardest job I've ever had, is teaching foreigners how to fly the F-16. It's patience, and the skill set is phenomenal. So I did that for a year, and then working at Delta. So I'm basically working 30 days a month every month, and I get a call from Gulfstream. Some folks I'd worked with at Tucson and at Edwards said, "Hey, we're building a new project. Can't tell you much about it, but we'd love to interview you and see if you come out and be on the team." And so I did that, got a job. Didn't think the family would want to move from Tucson, but they were all in for Savannah. And so we ended up at Gulfstream from 2016 to 2023, and started as a developmental test pilot working on, actually I started as a production test pilot for training, flying the G6, went into the G7 test program, the 500-600, which big differences are still digital flight controls like the G6, but it's an active side stick instead of a digital yoke. And we had all touch screens. Even the overhead panels were all touch screens. So some really neat technology, and different kind of flying, different clientele, and I just loved it. And so got to work developmental test and certification on the G500-600 under the G7 program. And then we started the G8 program, which was G700, G800. And somewhere in there, I fleet up to VP of Flight Ops, and I get to manage this amazing group of pilots, maintenance team, flight attendants. I had 2 dispatch organizations, aircrew publications. Anyway, it was super fun. My flying went down a little bit, but I got the benefit of getting to go fly a little bit with all the groups. So demo, airborne customer support, production test, and then still doing some developmental work. And Gulfstream builds beautiful airplanes. And the team they have there across the board in aviation, flying those airplanes, you can't beat it anywhere. And so it was great. And ended up with the opportunity to pick up some property out on a grass strip out close to Augusta. And we're on the South Carolina side near Aiken. And segued out to a little bit of a slower lifestyle in the country. And spent a couple years retired. I did do some floatplane flying one summer, de Havilland Beavers up in British Columbia and Washington, which was great. And then recently, I got an opportunity to go help out a company called Regent, which is based out of near Providence, Rhode Island. And the CEO is a fraternity brother of mine from MIT. And I was going to help them do some test prep and some planning and some safety reviews, and that turned into jumping in the vehicle and operating it, which has been super fun. And for those of you that don't know about Regent, I think it's gotten a little bit of press, but at a basic level, you think about it as an all-electric flying boat that just happens to fly, and it comes out of the water on foils, and then it launches into ground effect. And it's always over the water, and it always stays within one wingspan of the surface of the water. And therefore, it falls under Coast Guard regulations, not FAA, which has some interesting advantages. The mission right now for the prototype that we're looking at is hauling passengers in a ferry, and we call it a sea glider. And the ultimate objective for this project is for simplified vehicle operations, or SVO, which means you don't have to be a pilot to fly it. So you could put somebody in there that understands nautical rules of the road, basic handling, care and feeding of a boat around a dock, and let the automation and the autonomy do the navigation and the flying from point A to point B. So some really neat, again, I end up with some of these unusual projects where, your traditional skill set or how you approach stuff on your last project don't necessarily work. So lots of fun with that one.
Okay, has it been sorted yet for, we say rules of the road? If I'm coming from, point A to B and you're going from B to A, that, just like auto GCAS. I forget the air version of auto GCAS that Lockheed was testing out. I got to go mess around with that in the sim. But, it's smart enough if I'm non-pilot that, it's gonna avoid the collision there.
Yeah, so right now they've got folks. They're just starting to hire the autonomy team to go look at how do you just sense and detect and avoid.
Yeah.
Right now the operator, the captain of the vessel, is basically on the loop as opposed to in the loop. So you have a lever which at the bottom detent is a mode down. It's going backwards from the current mode you're in. If you push it up through there, you're getting typically increased prop RPM and speed out of the 12 electric motors that are aligned on the wings. And those obviously provide things like maneuvering torque when you're on the water, so you can spin it. So some of them can go in reverse, some of them go forward. When you get airborne, they actually provide blown lift, so it adds to your lift component. And then as you get to the upper range, you can mode up. So you can go from float, and you're driving it like a boat, and you have control of the rudder with a stick left and right. So it looks like a F-16 side stick, and you can basically turn it whichever direction you want, and then you can mode up to have it come up on the foil. Automatically comes up on the foil, lifts about 1.5 meters out of the water, and then the control laws keep it stable. So the wings don't bank. They hold level, and so as you turn, you're basically making a flat turn. You feel a little bit of side load, but you're using the foils to turn, and the foils auto control the pitch and the heave and the pitch of the vehicle. So up, down, and then nose to tail attitude, and then roll, and that's where we're at now. We're in the middle of the foil campaign, and we're up on Narragansett Bay. A couple times a week, and kind of putting it through its paces and collecting all the data, and then we'll build up in speed, and then eventually we'll get to the plan is 50 knots on the foil, and then the foils will command a launch, so they'll pitch you up or hold your pitch, but heave you out of the water, and then you'll pick up wing-borne lift. So kind of a unique concept there, and you're basically capturing something like 10 meters or less and flying, and it's basically all left right control and takeoff and land controls. So there's it's not piloting in the true sense. It is going to be simplified vehicle operations.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, again, I hope you're willing to hang around for there was. We'll have to do part 2, but before we part ways for this, is there anything I'm missing that I should be asking you that you want to talk about, or, parting wisdom for young Coma or anyone who's kind of going down this path?
I don't know. I think the big secret, like I said, my career path's been wacky, and I'm not sure I would necessarily want to do it all again either, but it was great. And I think the big secret is, surrounding yourself with great people. I was very fortunate, and if you can do it, surround yourself with people that are better than you. They always say if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room, right? And I was very fortunate. Everywhere I went, I had a built-in group of mentors that took an interest and helped me out. I showed up and worked hard, and some of my friends, I don't know if you know Brian Borgen, he always says, don't be afraid to pick up a broom, kind of A10 philosophy there. And then, carrying over from, weapons school, humble, approachable, credible, but do that with everybody, right? And you'll be surprised at what happens. Relationships matter. At the end of the day, a lot of doors got opened because, you don't burn them early on. And to me, the relationships with the people I have are the most important thing out of all of it. Got to fly some cool stuff, but I tell you right now, I have a lot of fun. I have great friends. I have great drinking buddies. I have an awesome family that's all very talented. I have this great set of musicians between Los Gringos and Trip and Snooze at Dos Gringos that I get the honor of being invited to go, sit at their side and play a few chords. And that's all I need, But it's that's what's important at the end of the day. And I think the Air Force, and especially aviation, gives you the opportunity to experience that. And to me, that's what I would tell people to do is, definitely enjoy that, milk that for all it's worth, and keep your friends close. So.
Yeah, it sounds like you've nailed it. So, Coma, thanks for taking the time today. Thanks for sharing just a little bit. Again, we'll have to do a part 2 here.
Yeah, no worries. Appreciate your time. Thanks.
15,000 RVs in the back.